Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our philosophy material. This is virtue ethics, and this is an agent-based character guiding normative moral theory. So please be sure to read the chapter from our open source textbook before proceeding. So virtue ethics fits into our overall discussion of ethics in a very unique way. So thus far, we've considered action-based moral theories, specifically consequentialism and deontology, as well as divine command theory. And what all of these views have in common, whether we're talking about egoism or utilitarianism, or divine command theory or Kantian deontology, is that they all essentially prescribe rules for telling us how to act or for determining which actions are justified and which ones aren't. And of course, the methods they use to do so differ greatly. That's safe to say, right? So in consequentialism, it's about the consequences. For egoism in particular, it's whether that is going to maximize the benefit for yourself, or in utilitarianism's case, whether it's going to maximize utility for the greatest number of people. In deontology, we use reason to determine which rules to follow. In divine command theory specifically, we get it from religious texts, right, or from God. And in Kantian deontology, we use reason and a good will to universalize an action or maxim that should be performed. And if we can't universalize it, then we shouldn't do it. So these are all action-based theories. Importantly, though, there's been a renewed interest and push into what we call agent-based views, and virtue ethics is certainly key among them. And virtue ethics has a long, storied history, going back to philosophers Aristotle and Confucius. And from there, we can talk about how to be a better person. And a more recent addition to the virtue ethics literature in the 20th century has been from feminism, specifically feminist care ethics. So we will talk about those as well. Okay, so we've already talked about this, right? Action-based theories focus on the rightness or wrongness of individual actions, whereas virtue ethics and feminist care ethics determine whether moral agents are virtuous or vicious. That is, a person's moral character is morally praiseworthy or blameworthy, depending on something inherent to the agent's relationship to themselves and others. So again, at its most basic level, agent-based ethics is about what kind of agent do we want to be? It's not about producing a laundry list of actions that one should or shouldn't perform. That isn't to say that agent-based theories say that anything goes, that to be a virtuous agent, you can just do whatever you feel like. That's not what they're prescribing. But rather than focusing on actions that produce overall consequences or things like that, instead, we should turn our moral telescope inward, right? And determine what kind of person we want to be. Okay, so Aristotle is obviously a very well-known and famous figure from the history of philosophy. Again, we've talked about some of his details before, but just as a reminder, 384 to 322 BCE, ancient Greek philosopher, very prolific writer, influenced most areas of philosophy, science, not just philosophy, but really gave us a lot of views that we still have today to some degree, or at least influenced our thinking in numerous ways. So Aristotle was also a student of Plato, and there are lots of themes associated with Aristotle. He was an empiricist at odds with his own teacher Plato, who was much more of, who was a rationalist, if you recall. And he has this famous book called the Nicomachean Ethics, which was named after his son. So according to Aristotelian virtue ethics, okay, we have a focus on what kind of person we want to be. And one story that we get from Plato very famously is what's called the Ring of Gyges, or Gyges' Ring. And this is very similar to the setup to the Lord of the Rings from Tolkien. So the idea is that what would we do if we had a ring that would essentially make us invisible? And we could get away with pretty much anything we wanted. We could take what we wanted. We could, the story goes, we could, you know, lie with whomever we wanted, right? The king's wife, things like that. Plato and Aristotle are going to use this story to say, yeah, it might be fun for a while to get away with stuff, but at the end of the day, what kind of person are you going to be? So instead of focusing on actions that, again, should or should not be performed, what the way Plato and Aristotle and other ancient philosophers thought about it is you're really harming yourself. You're harming your own soul when you act egotistically, right? So that's really the setup that motivates a lot of ancient Greek and as well as Chinese philosophy. So what do we mean by virtue? Well, according to Aristotle and others, it's about developing the right habits of feeling and action. What they're not just feelings. They have to be developed, okay? We have to develop dispositions of character. And this forms our nature, what makes us act or react in a certain way. And the reason that we want to do this is very similar to something else that we develop or cultivate. So maybe you are a musician. If so, fantastic. It takes practice, right? Same with sports. If you work out, or if you play a particular sport, you don't just show up and are brilliant the first day, or at least 99% of us aren't good at really anything the first time we try it. Instead, it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of trial and error. Aristotle and Confucius and other virtue ethicists thought this goes with morality as well. We don't just wake up and become ethical. We have to work at it. We have to cultivate certain habits and dispositions, like something simple like helping someone take their groceries inside for them, right? Your neighbor, or taking the trash out for your neighbor. We don't just become virtuous by doing one thing. Instead, we have to develop the right kind of habits. And just like we can develop the wrong kinds of habits. I mean, I'm sure we've all had bad habits in our past. It's hard to break them, right? But that's why we want to start, Aristotle thinks, we want to start off by teaching kids the right kind of habits from the earliest age. And that's going to require cultivation and effort. It's not easy, right, to do the right thing, just like it's not easy to become good at playing a musical instrument or become good at a sport or painting or whatever, right? It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to require a lot of resistance and choice. We got to keep with it. Just like education, whether it's a math class, a philosophy class, it's hard sometimes, and that's good. Aristotle and others think we need that. It can't just be easy, and it's not meant to be easy. Being a virtuous person takes a lot of work over a lifetime of cultivation and effort. So how do we decide what is right in virtue ethics? Well, we do use reason, because there is an intellectual understanding of how we ought to act. And that allows us to derive more pleasure from virtue as cultivation proceeds. And it's also going to require humility. It's going to allow us to realize that we are not completely virtuous and that we're going to stumble. But that's not an excuse to do bad things, but it is going to show us that it's going to require trial and error. So this is where the famous Greek Aristotelian word eudaimonia comes in. And by this, Aristotle and others think virtue is about activity of the soul in accordance with excellence. It really means human flourishing. And Aristotle's ethics, as well as other virtue ethicists, think that we cannot simply become virtuous overnight, right? It's tied with a lifetime of trial and error, and human flourishing is really something that is going to require a lot of patience. And so our notions, in other words, of human excellence are intimately tied with our notions of ethics for Aristotle and others. This is the function of humankind, according to Aristotle. We become more excellent over time, and we should strive to do that, right? That's why we should not adopt egoism. It's a flourishing of the spirit. And this leads to happiness, right? The emotional kind plus the intellectual kind, knowing that we've started to settle on the right kind of habits and cultivated the right kind of dispositions. And these are the things that are intrinsically valuable. This is the end in itself rather than a means. So it's different than Kant. So how do we identify virtue? Well, very famously, Aristotle gives us the doctrine of the mean, or the golden mean. So if you've ever heard of everything in moderation, this essentially comes back to Aristotle, right? If I eat an entire pizza, right, I'm going to overdo it. That's excess. But if I don't eat anything ever, obviously that's going to be a deficiency. So Aristotle thinks that virtue is the same. Virtue is identified by aiming for the mean between two extremes. Okay, so it is objective. It cannot be added to or taken away from without destroying the virtue. And it does involve moderation, neither excessive nor deficient. It is contextual, subjective to the individual and their circumstances in that moment, right? So obviously what is the proper amount for Anthony to eat is going to be different than the proper amount for you to eat, or other things like that. But nonetheless, we have to cultivate that pattern of choice over a lifetime, and that's going to require practice. So that's why we really emphasize habits in virtue ethics, development of either virtuous or vicious characters. So just like the egoist can become a habitual vicious person, so too can a virtuous person become habitually a virtuous person, or develop a virtuous character over their lifetime. Okay, so what would a virtuous person do? Well, according to Aristotle and others, to be virtuous is to choose to do the virtuous thing, to decide, right? There does have to be a choice involved. It's to do the virtuous thing knowingly, which is going to require reason. So when we decide to do that, we have to do it for itself, not for any other reason. So in that sense, it's intrinsic. We don't decide to do it because it helps us. That's egoism. And Aristotle is not advocating egoism. But we do need to use reason, and we need to exert effort for resistance of the vice, right? And that's going to require struggle. Just like breaking a bad habit is going to require a lot of struggle, so too does it require a lot of effort to develop good habits. And we have to cultivate that. We have to do the virtuous thing from a firm and unchanging disposition of character. So that's how we develop character. We have to practice over a lifetime, not assessing individual actions, but rather developing the right habits over a lifetime. So in other words, we have to do what a virtuous person would do in that situation, Aristotle thinks. So here's a list of Aristotle's virtues. I think this has a lot of intuitive appeal, right? So if you take, let's take an example. Let's see, fear and confidence. Okay, good example. I mean, he actually uses the example of a soldier in battle. Now, if you're deficient in fear and confidence, then you're going to be cowardly. You're going to run for the hills at the first sign of trouble. Okay. Now, what would be excessive in that case? Well, just running right into the battle without waiting for, any orders, or without assessing the situation. The mean is going to be somewhere in between there, right? The same with, reputation or anger, right? We could be, or self-expression. We could be too truthful, right? Don't you know people who always tell you, too much information? But on the flip side, the deficiency would be understatement or not being revealing enough. So the mean or the virtue is going to be between those two things, truthfulness, or same with social conduct, right? I mean, the virtuous person is going to aim between two extremes, right? Like for shame, modesty is between shamelessness and shyness, right? So the virtuous person is going to aim for the golden mean between these two these two extreme positions, deficiency on one side and excess on the other. So just like we can eat pizza in moderation, we can also become a virtuous person by aiming at the mean, not having too much and not having too little. So objections to Aristotelian virtue ethics. One is, what about automatic or instinctual responses? So some people might say, look, there are just some people who are naturally virtuous. Aristotle doesn't really seem to agree with that. He thinks that virtue has to be developed. People might have more natural dispositions to act a certain way, but Aristotle doesn't think that there are automatic or instinctual virtuous people. So that could be one way to object to Aristotle's characterization. If a response does not require cultivation and can be done without effort, is it not virtuous? So this is something I've always thought about. I've known a handful of people in my life who it does not seem to be a struggle for them to be kind and generous, or at least much more so than me. And I'm always striving to do that. But I've known someone in my own life who it seemed to be second nature to them to be kind, to never say anything really negative. So it's more of a struggle for me and less of a struggle for them. So what would Aristotle say about that? Because he seems to imply that the more struggle, the better. But what about the people who never struggle? Don't we want to say they're more virtuous? Aristotle seems to suggest the otherwise, right? That it should require effort. And if it doesn't, then they're not as virtuous, but that seems to be counterintuitive. Do the virtues conflict? This is another common criticism, that maybe it's hard to separate which virtue applies to which case. May not be a fatal criticism. Aristotle thinks that the virtues are unified, they never conflict. Some people don't like that. What counts as virtuous changes depending on the context or the person. So a lot of people think that this is too contextual of an ethical theory, that's why we like the action-based theories, because they tell us exactly what to do in each case. Whereas with virtue ethics, that's not really what it's about. It is going to change depending on the context or person. And for many people, that doesn't seem to be as motivating as, say, deontology or utilitarianism, which tells you exactly what to do in every case. So a worry might be that this just leads to moral relativism. I think that's not a really strong criticism in the end, but I understand why people would potentially think that this contextualized ethics can lead to that kind of moral ambiguity in certain cases. Other objections: can we ever become fully virtuous if it takes a lifetime? Aristotle says no, but is that a problem? I mean, go back to the sports example. No one ever gets perfect. No one ever becomes a perfect basketball or tennis player, right? It's not like even the best players in the world, Serena Williams in tennis or Roger Federer, they don't make every shot, and they're not hoping to make every shot, but they certainly get better over time. So maybe that's not a problem, right? It's not like we ever become fully virtuous, but we strive to, right? So maybe that's not a bad thing in the end. There's also the epistemological problem. This is a common objection. How can we know what a virtuous person would do if we've never been around a virtuous person? Well, Aristotle thinks that this is all the more reason why to surround young children with virtuous people from a very early age, so that we can have them develop the right character and the right habits right from the start, right? Because as we know, as we get older, it's harder and harder to develop new habits, and it becomes even harder and harder to break old bad habits. This could lead to a circularity problem. So if we need a virtuous moral agent to know what to do, then it seems like we're just saying, well, what would a virtuous person do in this case? Well, what a virtuous person would do, but that seems circular, okay? So is that a fatal problem? Not necessarily, but it is a problem that's often invoked against Aristotelian virtue ethics. Another possible worry is asking what kind of person should I be better than asking what should I do? Because some people think, again, this is what we like about the action-based theories, that I'm trying to decide what to do in this case. And just simply saying, do what a virtuous person would do doesn't really seem to give me any guidance. Whereas utilitarianism is pretty simple, right? Do the action that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. But virtue ethics isn't in that business. It's right. It's trying to develop character, dispositions of character over a lifetime. So it's not really going to be in a position to tell us that. For some people, that's a major advantage, but a lot of people might not. This is, I think, perhaps the most motivating criticism is to essentially claim that perhaps virtue ethics reduces to an action-based theory, that if we're trying to figure out how to apply the doctrine of the mean, that just is essentially an action-based theory, right? Applying the doctrine of the mean in some case is potentially just an action-based theory. That's not necessarily the case if you ask certain virtue ethicists, but it is a possible objection that they're going to have to respond to. So leaving Aristotle aside, there are other virtue theoretic accounts. As we mentioned, in the West, there is the infamous Aristotle, but there have been more recent virtue ethicists, especially in the 20th century, Philosoph-HER, Martha Nussbaum, Linda Zagzebski. These two are both alive and well, and I've heard Martha Nussbaum speak. She's fantastic. She's a modern virtue ethicist, does a lot of work on ancient philosophy. But there's also Eastern perspectives, right? So we see it in the Buddha, and we also see it in Confucius. So in the West, in Aristotle's notion of virtue ethics, the goal is the good life, or eudaimonia, human flourishing, right? Finding that sweet spot or that golden mean, that leads to flourishing. Whereas in Eastern accounts, specifically in Buddhism, the goal is similar but slightly different. It's perfect character, or ideally enlightenment, what's often called nirvana. In Western virtue ethics, the goals are slightly different. For neo-Aristotelians and even feminists, the goal would be a flourishing communal self, whereas in Confucian virtue ethics, the goal is a noble person, which often translates into peace and harmony, right? Contentedness. So let's say just a little bit more about Chinese virtue ethics. Chinese virtue ethics is very much tied to Chinese social and political philosophy, especially for Confucius. And while I'm not an expert on Chinese philosophy by any stretch of the imagination, there are some common threads here that can be deciphered from Confucius. So if we look back at some of the texts, and this is mentioned, I think, in the reading, a lot of the moral conversation has to do with the social and political climate in what we now call China at the time. And at the time Confucius was writing, there was a lot of chaos and a lot of warfare in ancient China after the fall of the Zhou dynasty. And then there was a lot of responses. So this is what's called the 100 schools. Many independent thinkers, time of plurality and diversity. A lot of thinkers come forward with various accounts for how to provide social harmony. And they have roughly the same goal, all attempted to resolve the chaos and bring about unity and peace, but just in different ways. So there's a couple general approaches. We have Confucianism, Taoism, Moism, and legalism. And this gets incorporated into a couple different strands of Eastern philosophy, modeling and ritual, spontaneous nature, utilitarianism, and ethical egoism. But Confucius's focus is on mostly this goal, bringing about unity and peace, not just with the community, but with oneself. So in Confucian virtue ethics, so we call him Confucius, which is the Latinized name, but that wasn't his actual name. He's often referred to as Master Kung. Okay, so 551 to 479, so before Aristotle. As I said, he had the motivation of trying to think about socio and economic injustice. There were ruling classes that were luxurious and leisurely lifestyles, but there are peasants who are burdened with labor and heavy taxes. So what's the problem? Well, the ideal person would aspire to position of power motivated only by desire to bring harmony to the people. And this leads to a slightly different track for Confucius than Aristotle, right? So like Aristotle, Confucius thinks that we need to focus on modeling and practice. We learn best by example. Okay, so that is definitely something that Confucian virtue ethics and Aristotelian virtue ethics have in common. That we want to model good behavior and try to break the habit of modeling bad behavior. And this is going to require nurturing. We need better people to model virtuous behavior and focus on ruling class as those with position to model. So in other words, the people in charge should be the ones setting the example. So similar to Aristotle, they both thought that those in charge should be the best of us, the best among us. You don't want the person in charge to be someone who doesn't have the right temperament. So this is a very foreign view to us in America in particular, right? Where a lot of people say we just want to elect the average Joe or the average Josephine, right? That's not something that the ancient Greeks or Chinese would think was a great idea. And maybe you don't think it is even in 2021. There's a strong case to be made for that, but that's another conversation. Nonetheless, the people in charge should be the ones setting a good example. And right, this is going to be very crucial. So this leads into this notion of the junzi, or superior person, the unfaltering strength of character plus mastered rituals. So very similar to Aristotle, but framed in a different way. And this leads to this concept of a sage, which maybe you've heard of before. This is the master. This is the junzi without conscious effort. This is the virtuous person who does the right thing for the right reasons, and it doesn't require effort on their part. They just naturally do it, right? So maybe we're thinking of even religious characters as sages, right? It's just so instinctual for them to do the right thing for the right reasons. It doesn't even really require any effort on their part. So notice the similarities between Confucian virtue ethics and Aristotelian. There's a lot of really interesting overlap and important differences. Of course, Confucius is, again, much more focused on responding to the contemporary problems of his socioeconomic circumstances than Aristotle, but nonetheless, a lot of interesting overlap. So how do we cultivate virtue according to Confucius? Very similar. Practice refers to the content of one's character over a lifetime, and do the right thing for the right reason and take joy in doing it. And it's also going to involve a lot of rituals, which is quite different from Aristotle. By choice, for the right reason, with effort and intention, that part is similar. But in Chinese philosophy, there's a much greater emphasis on cultural rituals, right? Much more so than even the Greeks at the time. And what's the ideal moral agent like? Well, derive principles from deference to moral authorities. We want to emulate those in charge, those in positions of authority, to give us the ways in which we can model our own behavior. Sometimes we see this invocation of what's called the five bonds. And this is where Confucius talks about the obligations we have to others, right? That when we're virtuous, this has a ripple effect, or the ripple effect of virtue. It starts ideally with the family, right? Being virtuous and being temperate with members of one's own family, whether it's kids, spouse. So the society should be modeled around the family, right? Respect, reverence for the elderly, reverence for moral and political authorities. And this is going to ripple out into the community as a whole. So the superior person is going to develop habits that are firm and from an unchanging disposition. So this is Confucius's list of virtues. Notice how similar and different they are from Aristotle. So we have goodness, righteousness, ritual propriety, conscientiousness. A lot of similar things, but also really important differences, right? So This idea of Ren is very crucial to Confucius. This is the notion of goodness or humane love plus civilized person. So it's an ideal relationship between two human beings. And this is a master virtue, right? Cultivating the right relationship with others. So you can, also I want to highlight this. This is a very interesting but important distinction. Confucius talks a lot about piety, about reverence for one's parents, right? That they need to be cared for, especially the elders in one's community, even over oneself. This is a very, I mean, we even see these cultural distinctions today, right? In the West, we tend to, we just have a different way of approaching, for the most part, family relationships than even certain cultures in Asia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. Confucius is very, very adamant about a virtuous person being devoted to one's parents and elders as an extension of virtue, even over and above one's own self. So, important point to make there. Okay, possible objections. Again, what about conflicting virtues? That could be an issue. Confucius differs from Aristotle here. Confucius thinks that you can weigh conflicting virtues, and those are going to be context dependent. Whether or not that's going to be motivating for everyone, it's not going to be clear. But some people take issue with Confucius for that. Yeah, one possible criticism is that this reliance on the people in charge being the virtuous agents, that's going to lead to political nepotism, right? And again, that gets us into some political conversations. But for the time being, there is this objection that why is it that we should assume that the people in charge are or should be the ideal moral agents? Again, for Confucius, those are one and the same. The people in authority should be the ones that are held to a higher standard. That sounds nice, right? The 5 bonds might lead to authoritarianism, right? What if you disagree with that? Again, that's a socio-political conversation. One major criticism that will lead into another section that we'll discuss is that there are some misogynistic attributes throughout Confucius's writing. So assumptions about the way men think and act, and assumptions about the way women think and act, and that there are pretty obvious instances, and certainly in Aristotle this is the case as well, not just claims about the inferiority of women, but also of, in Aristotle's case, of slaves. So Aristotle is very quick to justify and defend slavery, which was quite common in Greece in the 4th century BCE. And it was also the case with Confucius, especially in his thinking about men versus women. Okay, so that's a common criticism of Confucius, because Confucius thinks that women cannot be sages, and also that women have separate virtues from men. So this is an interesting conversation, but for time's sake, we'll have to leave it aside. But that is certainly a big criticism that comes into both forms of virtue ethics. Okay, appeals of virtue ethics. There are a lot. Generous. It allows individuals to be flawed, make mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes and still be a good person. Intuitive, for a lot of people, for good reason, maybe more intuitive than action-based theories if we want to give people moral credit, even though they did the wrong thing. It's also contextual. It allows specific aspects of the situation, as well as the people involved, to play a role in moral rightness or wrongness. And for Eastern virtue ethics in particular, the negative golden rule may be a better guiding principle than the latter formulation. So there are a lot of appeals of virtue ethics, both Western and Eastern. I'll leave it there for now, but a lot of people, I think, really appreciate virtue ethics and can even find something relatable. If you're like me, as I said earlier, I was raised with someone that I considered to be a moral exemplar, and I learned a lot from her. And I still think that I'm a better person because of her. And that's credit to the virtue ethical account, right? Modeling our behavior, trying to be a good person. We make mistakes, but it's what kind of person we are over a lifetime that makes all the difference. So a lot of nice appeals, intuitive appeals about virtue ethics. All right, let me leave it there. If you have any questions, as always, let me know, and I will talk to you next time.